This is Minda Wilson with Urgent Care, and I'm really excited to welcome my guest today, Brian Boyd. He's an expert on intelligence and analysts and counterterrorism, and lots going on in the world, and he can certainly give us his insights onto what's happening. Welcome, Brian.
Thank you very much, Minda. Nice to hear from you.
So, first of all, I think I want to talk to you about what's going on with China. How do you feel this is all going to play out? Are we going to have a relationship with China? Are we not? Are we going to have masks in the future? Are we going to have to make them ourselves? What's our plan?
Well, China is always going to be a trading partner. No matter how you shake it out, they're part of the world economy like any other nation. The problem is, and if you listen to the Trump administration, they're always talking about the codependence on China for so many things. And one of the biggest issues is the shift of all of our pharmaceuticals, which used to be manufactured in Puerto Rico, till recent administrations passed that over to China for cheaper labor. Well, the problem now is that if they can mess with our products, so I think this administration is trying to get the pharmaceutical industry back into the United States soil, much like we did with the oil industry, so we're not so dependent on foreign governments. Beyond that, there's a wheat deal going on, and the Chinese need food. Much of the reason they were involved in Vietnam over the years was because of the rice issue. It had very little to do with communism or democracy. It's because Vietnam was rice rich and they were a starving nation. So we do need China. The trick is to do it so they're not stealing our secrets. That's why the Houston consulate was closed, and then the Chinese did quid pro quo and closed ours over there. But that's part of it. But the mask issue, I think the world is going to be faced with that until probably a vaccine is developed. And much like the issue of polio over the years or the old days of the plague, it'll eventually become a change in our world. But it's going to be pretty much dependent on the vaccines that get produced and how it'll change our society.
Yeah, but when we had our initial Trump fight with China, and we stopped importing their goods, the one thing that I learned out of that was that all the tooling was in China. So even if we wanted to move the site of manufacturing, we really didn't have the ability to do the tooling, which is what's required to make products. So do you think there's going to be a move in the United States to sort of train people to do things, to build things here in the United States? I mean, Intel just announced that the last American semiconductor maker, that they're probably not going to be able to make semiconductors in the US anymore. I mean, it makes us very vulnerable, don't you think?
Well, I haven't thought about the concept of semiconductors, but again, if we step away from the politics of the issue and realize that the world is dependent on trade, okay, and I think the issue has to do with fair trade, and because they need products and we need products, there is a normal decision to do it. That's why he cut a trade deal with food, with the farmers. That's good for the farmers. It's good for China because they need wheat and they need the food. That's their biggest issue. They don't have enough to manufacture food. Now, because their labor is cheap, and a lot of their labor is done under threat of a machine gun, and they're doing it in factories, they do it on cheap labor. So that's part of our problem. We started shifting our industry to cheap labor. We sort of did the same thing with Mexico. The farmers in this country were subsidizing the illegal immigrants because it was cheaper labor. Going back to the issue in California, remember the lettuce issue? I can't think the gentleman got on that. But tomato farms, lettuce, and that was part of the issue. So there has to be some sort of a fair trade setup. The other issue is the stealing of our secrets. Mm-hmm. And this is one of the bigger problems with the intelligence community is the Chinese were stealing our secrets, our manufacturing secrets. Somewhere there has to be a balance, and I think it has a lot to do with fair trade as well as trying not to always steal our technology.
Do you feel like let's take TikTok as an example. You know, Trump is saying now that people who work in the government can't put it on their phone. To me, it's provocative. So, do you think that that makes it harder to have fair trade when you're acting in an antagonistic way? Do you think it's easier? I mean, on the one hand, he's provoking TikTok, and on the other hand, we're having antitrust hearings in the Capitol to break up competitors to TikTok. So it's the juxtaposition of those two is sort of interesting to me.
I see your point, but I think if we kind of step away and understand most of what's going on in the communist world, we tend to be complacent as a nation. We take for granted our freedoms, and yet we're missing out on the horrific changes in Hong Kong, which has been a democratically free society for over 100 years. Now, if you were a Hong Kong resident and you see the fear of the Chinese being able to pick you up and extradite you to China for all kinds of crazy infractions, and the young people there are scared to death because they're used to having cell phones and stuff, where in China they're restricted on information. They restrict any form of information sharing.
That's true.
So we have to be cautious and not just assume that everybody's our friend out there, okay? Russia used to be a serious threat with the Soviet Union. Now it's a much smaller nation, and they're struggling to survive economically because they're poor. They got more billionaires there than the United States does, but it's because of the history of the KGB. Now, in the China situation, we can't assume that they're going to be fair in our relationships with them. There is a way to make it work. You got to remember they're dependent on us for food. So they do need our farming capability. We are dependent on them, but we don't want to give up our manufacturing secrets. And if you think about it, if more and more manufacturers and United States people start getting back involved in things like that, we can make semiconductors. This country is smart. But again, much of our relationships had to do with us shoving cheaper labor overseas. I read the other day about how Puerto Rico suffered. This goes several administrations back, Republican and Democrat, where they gave up the manufacturing of pharmaceuticals in Puerto Rico to China for cheaper labor. Well, that deflated the economy in Puerto Rico, but it was done because of cheap labor. Now we're paying the price in reverse. So we have to worry about our pharmaceuticals being adulterated or stuff. You're seeing this thing with all these seeds being sent out in the mail. You following that? China's, they have an agenda. They don't want us to be around. And Chinese history is quite different from American history. You know, they have a goal and they want to be a superpower. And when you follow the communist agenda versus the democracies of the world, it's not a happy way to look.
So when you tell us a little bit more about the seeds and what's happening with that.
I just saw that in the news, much like you did. If you think about the game of spy versus spy, you probably grew up and knew that as a kid. Remember the black and white guys? And you know the James Bond business and that sort of thing. When you look at the history of the espionage world, and you understand that particular society over there wants to do everything they can to conflagrate our problems. In the early days of the Chinese thing, when they thought this was from the wet markets, the COVID issue, and then they discovered a Wuhan market. It wasn't a Wuhan market. It was a research center. Now you start to think about the conspiracy theory. Did the Chinese do this on purpose to create havoc in the world, or did they do virus research and it got out of hand? Well, there's two thinkings on that. You can think the conspiracy theory, or you can realize that whatever happened, they still created the problem and the epidemic got out of hand. A little bit like what happened in Russia with Chernobyl. You know, that was a secret society. They kept that one down until the cloud of radiation started falling on Sweden and Norway. You know,
right.
So again, these are issues when you have people in the world who don't like us, and you have to be very alert to these kind of issues. So the seed thing, could be another way to do covert behavior on us, you know?
Right. Now, how do you think India is going to come out in all this? Because if they're a democracy, sort of. They're certainly English speaking. Their society is very technologically competent. They have more engineers there than we do. Do you think that they're going to act as a buffer between China and the United States?
Well, there's a paradox to your question. They don't have a choice. Geographically, they're right up against China, so they are literally a buffer.
Right.
But they're not being played by us to be a buffer. They have a different society. They want to live peacefully. They have border disputes, and it's very serious there, but they've had those things for 40, 50, 60 years of disputes on that border, and they are shooting at each other. Now, India is free, and they want to exist. China, do they have an aggression policy against India? No, I think they're more interested in stealing secrets from the Indian society, too. Anytime you have free world trade or free societies where their engineers are smart people, and in a country that's closed like China, they're going to do whatever it takes to get technology. And it's a huge cesspool of spying, and that's just the nature of their society.
So you think it's cultural then? They're just acquisitive by any means?
I don't know if it's their culture. If we look at the world as communism versus the free world of democracies, yeah, anytime you have a communist society where they believe the state has all the wealth and not the population, which is the reverse of our comments, we believe in the freedom of making money. They believe the state is, they control the money and the people are too stupid to handle it. That's kind of the fundamental behavior of communism. So in that particular case, it's not so much their Chinese culture. Their history is fascinating. If you go back and study the history of the Ming Dynasty and that sort of thing, it's when they became communist, and under the communist rule, that is what changed. It's not Chinese people or Chinese culture. That's beautiful culture. It's the rule of communism that is creating the problem.
Mm-hmm. And how is that so?
As far as what? How's that so? You mean as far
Well, how
as,
is it creating the problem? Like, do you think if there was no longer communism, that things would be different in China? I mean, it seems like they've sort of developed a hybrid model where some people have managed to accumulate great wealth. So I'm not quite sure how.
You mean great wealth in China?
Yes.
Well, if you look at the world's billionaires, if you go look at Forbes or one of the other publications and look where all the world's billionaires are, there are more billionaires in Russia than all of the United States and the rest of the free world. Well, how is that possible? Well, if you think of the era with the KGB, and they controlled everything, and when the Soviet Union dissolved, the people in power were the KGB. So it's filled with lots of corruption. It's a corrupt system. And you got Putin, who keeps wanting to be the president for life. He kind of reelected himself over and over again, and he's looking for a successor one day. But the wealth is all concentrated that way. In China, there's wealth. But how do you become a billionaire in China when there's not free ability to do it? Well, it's because they have a controlled system. It isn't a free system. They can't earn it the way they do. Our billionaires are different, and many of these billionaires in our country didn't inherit it. They came about as a result of entrepreneurship. A lot of people think billionaires were born into it, but most of our billionaires were from being entrepreneurs. In China, it has a lot to do with the control of the money in their system. I think the Hong Kong issue is probably one of the scariest things that we need to watch, because with China, they've broken all their promises. They've broken every single promise that was arranged with the Brits when it became free. And that's part of the issue. That's part of the issue right now. They're not keeping their promise on anything. And how do you enforce it? How do you force a major nation to be fair? Well, the only leverage you have is, the only leverage this administration has is the economic leverage. You can't use nuclear weapons. You can't go in and force an overthrow of the government. You have to learn to to work the economy. The economy is how the world turns. And if nothing has been more successful in this particular administration is the ability to help manage the economy so that they will come to the table. You're following this thing with Germany, for example, with their pulling the troops out and why that's all, what that's all about?
No, so tell us about that.
Well, the recent the news thing is Trump is pulling 10,000 troops out of Germany. Well, now there's a hue and cry on both sides of the aisle as to why they're doing that. And I listened to his talk on the White House lawn the other day, and he's doing it because Germany's not paying their fair share. Now, the Germany's playing both sides against the middle. Germany wants American support to protect themselves against the Russians. And yet they're dealing with the Russians on buying oil and gas. Well, that's sort of a quid pro quo. If they're really dependent on the Russia for oil and gas, and then they're playing with the enemy, and yet they're depending on America to provide support with American troops. Now, the other nations in the NATO thing, most of the other nations are paying their fair share. And he's trying to get Germany to say, look, if you expect us to provide defense for you, then you either have to work with us economically or you're going to have to pay your portion of the NATO contract. I think that's interesting because he's causing these other nations to stop using America to provide free support of our troops, and we're getting taken advantage of economically. So if you listen to his comment, whether you like Trump or not, he's pretty smart on understanding the economy of the world to cause people to want to play fair. I think that's one of the more interesting things about this administration because he's not playing politics. Apparently, he doesn't care about politics. So I think it's kind of amusing if you study how the world really operates. Do you know why we got into Afghanistan, for example? Just to sort of throw another issue in here for you. A lot of people don't understand why we got in Afghanistan. The only reason Afghanistan has any role in the world, it's not because the Russians want to turn them communist or the Americans want to make them a democracy. It's because Afghanistan is the world supply for opium. And opium is the most valuable commodity in the entire world. It's worth more money than gold and silver. And the opium trade kind of keeps the world going. And as long as there's drugs and drug trafficking, everybody wants opium. Opium is farmed there. A kilo of that goes for maybe about 10 or 20 bucks. That's a lot of money for a farmer. That's like a year's income to him. But by the time it leaves there and it's turned into morphine and then morphine to heroin, it supplies the world. But it is a valuable commodity. And so the interest there of the Russians is to control the money. It's a money business, and it's a country without a government. It's run by tribal fiefdoms, and there's a government in Kabul, but the rest of the country is not run by a government. It's not a series of states or provinces. It's run by tribal fiefdom lords, warlords.
So because of the value of the opium, it's been sort of a target for governments because they want to control. I'm confused. I don't understand. So
well, the Russian interest in it was for money. The Russian interest was for money. The United States was trying to get the Russians out of there because of the strategic fear of it and because of what they were going to do to the United States. So we were there trying to kick the Russians out. We weren't there to control the opium traffic. That was not our interest. Our interest was to get the Russians out of there. And that's a war we got dragged into for the longest time. So 16, 18 years. I don't know how many years we've been caught up in that thing. So that's part of the issue there. But the only interest in Afghanistan historically was because of the opium trade. So there's no interest to turn it into a democracy, or a communist state. That's what's kind of funny about it.
Right, but also isn't there sort of a religious conflict going on as well between Muslims and
well, the Muslim world is divided into two entities. If you go back to Muhammad, and he had a wife and child on one side, and you had a mistress and a child on the other. I'm not going to get into the specifics of it, but it kind of created two factions, the Shia and the Sunni. Okay, and the Muslim world spends more time fighting among themselves than they do fighting the Christians. And during the Iraqi war, there were more Muslims being killed than the Christians. And in Iraq, when Saddam Hussein was there, he decided to invade Kuwait. And his logic to his people was because it was a Shia province, and he wanted to make it the 19th province. So he was giving the story to his own country that he was taking over Kuwait to reunite the Shia world. Sunni. I'm sorry, I'm getting mixed up on my religion here while I'm talking to you. The reason he actually went into Kuwait was because he was a landlocked nation, and he couldn't get his oil out except through smuggling routes across the desert of other countries. So he wanted Kuwait because it's a seaport, and it would allow him to export his oil through there. So he invaded Kuwait, which was a free nation. And it took the Bush administration and the United Nations something like 17 UN resolutions demanding that he get out of Kuwait. Now, the United Nations spent a year and a half or longer constantly as a body resolving to have him leave Kuwait. Well, he wouldn't pay attention. There was nobody to police the action. And so a coalition was formed about a dozen countries, and that's what created the invasion during General Schwarzkopf's era, where he went in and threw the Iraqis out of Kuwait. And that was the shortest war we ever had, I think, 7 or 8 days. But the purpose of that was to get them to leave the country. It was not to destroy the Iraqi army, because those guys were not there voluntarily. They were under conscription by Saddam Hussein. And I think you know the rest of the story.
Tell us.
War is fought over 3 issues in general. We fight war over religion. We fight war over over world's resources, and we fight war for access to the sea. These are some of the basic principles of why war occurs. The reason the United States has never been really invaded is because we're surrounded by water. The reason Switzerland is not invaded is because it's surrounded by mountains. The reason Poland falls every time is because it's flat, and tanks can roll across and invade. And so if you understand how the world runs and understand why things occur, this is where people like Russia and other places, that's why they have an interest in the world, okay? Their interest in South Africa is because of diamonds. Their interest in Suriname is because of bauxite, which is the basic and creating aluminum and titanium. But that's really the logic when you look at the world as to why people fight. And as you know, we fight over religion, believe it or not.
So what you're saying is that essentially Russia has always been motivated by economics. It's a pure economic play for them. That China has been motivated by the need to acquire technology and the need for food. And that the United States motivation has sort of been to preserve a status quo where these people don't get what they want. I'm not clear.
I wouldn't say the United States is involved as a status quo. We have inherited the old adage of becoming the world's policeman. Now, this administration is trying to get us out of wars, and you have to understand his logic because he got elected on the basis of getting our military to come out of these wars, and that was one of his many platforms. We've gotten dragged into wars historically. A lot of people don't realize the Vietnam War had nothing to do with Johnson or Kennedy. It had a lot to do with Eisenhower signing a non-aggression treaty with those nations against Chinese communist aggression. And that treaty goes back to the 50s, saying that world wants to live free. Well, Laos and Cambodia, and particularly Thailand, did survive it, but Vietnam did not, because Chinese wanted South Vietnam, which was rice-rich. North Vietnam didn't have anything. So that was why it was a North-South war. And Ho Chi Minh sought support from China, because way back when the United States didn't have any interest in Vietnam, so we ignored his pleas for financial support. There's a lot of paradox there. The United States in general is all about maintaining the free world. And we live in a bubble, if you don't mind the joke. We live in a bubble. We take our freedoms for granted. We take our Pledge of Allegiance for granted. We take the prayer in schools for granted. We take a lot of things for granted. And as we start to discuss internal issues, people who are not sophisticated, people who don't understand world history, people don't travel around the world and see the horrors of socialism and communism. I have a lot of friends from Venezuela, and they hear all these social issues being discussed here, and they said, you should go to Venezuela and see what happened to what used to be a free economy and a very wealthy nation, now under socialist rule and almost in financial ruin. Talk to your Vietnamese friends. A lot of Vietnamese died in a war for freedom, and now it's a communist country where we buy stuff from them and buy shirts and things like that, and yet they're not doing it under the freedom of economic support. They can't live free. So the United States is not about quid pro quo. We like I said, we're a free nation, and people leave everybody in the world. People leave countries to come to the United States because of the opportunity. That's one of the ironic things that people complain about our society. I tell them, try somewhere else, and then ask people from other countries, why is it they come to the United States? They come for freedom of religion. They come for freedom of the press. They come for freedom of expression. They come because they can live and talk free. You can criticize everybody and not get jailed for it. You can't do that in most countries in the world.
So what would you like to see happen? Like going forward, what would you like to see the Trump administration accomplish that would sort of get us out of this position of being the policeman of the world and yet enable us to enjoy the security that being the policeman, when you're the policeman, you have a sense of security, right? You have a sense of control. So if we get out of being the policeman of the world, we give up the control. What are we going to do to replace that so that we can preserve our ability to control our freedoms and not give them up?
Well, there's a couple of things that I have expressed on. You know my background a little bit. I was an intelligence analyst with the Defense Department, the Justice Department, and the Treasury Department. I'm one of the few people who's out of the government who served in all three of those government agencies over the years. And much like Bob Gates, who became the director of the CIA, the Secretary of Defense, he was an intelligence analyst, but he spent his career at the CIA and Defense. I spent it in three other agencies over the years, so I have an interesting perspective, and I participate in a lot of things. One of the things that I would like to see, and this is where I'm sort of stumping for a moment, we need to put integrity back into the government. I have two grown daughters and son-in-laws, and they've all served. And they've done various things to make our nation free. So I'm all about God and country, and I'm not talking religion. But what I'm trying to say is that if we could get integrity back in the government, and we can increase the intelligence capabilities and keep it honest. Whenever I gave intelligence briefings, whether it was the White House people or a commanding general or the director of a federal agency, I was always respected because I gave straight answers. And I'm appalled by some of the actions of what happened with the FBI, with Stroke and Page and McCabe and Comey. I mean, that's horrible. How can you tell kids to want to become an FBI agent with those kind of poor role models? How can you tell people to go in the intelligence community when you see it weaponized by people? And the biggest thing I want to see is integrity in the government. I want transparency in the government. I want transparency in our communities. It's a double-edged sword in the intelligence game. You got to be able to keep secrets, but you also have to have transparency because you can't hide things under the guise of being top secret when you make mistakes. And when mistakes are made, you have to be transparent. I used to have the Washington Post in my office a lot of times. They'd ask me tough questions about a case or an operation. And I told them, I said, you have the right to know because the press has to know. But you have to be honest with me as well and be straight with it. So we can't have any problems with it. So that's why you have to have integrity in government. That's why you have to have integrity in the federal law enforcement community. You have to have integrity in the intelligence business.
Brian, I appreciate your insight. I think the idea of integrity in government is a great goal for our country, and what I hope you get the support you need to sort of move things there. If people want to reach out to you to support you in what you're doing, what's the best way for them to contact you?
I have a website. It's called boydintelligence.com, and you could find me there. And people will certainly be willing to talk about things very openly. I'll tell you some books that might you find interesting to read about. One of them is a book I gave my daughter when she served in Baghdad. It's called Never Surrender by General J. Boykin. It's a very good book. He participated along with Delta and the Joint Special Operations Command in the operation into Mogadishu. The other book I recommend is The Operators by Michael Hastings. Michael Hastings was the Rolling Stone reporter embedded with General McChrystal as the ISAF commander in the Middle East. The other book is Duty by Bob Gates. And Bob Gates wrote a beautiful piece of what it was like to be the Secretary of Defense and the CIA director during Obama and Bush. So he's a very balanced individual. It's a pretty good piece of explaining all the decision-making process. When you understand how Obama made the decision with his counsel to go after bin Laden, and you see how Trump did the same thing, it's the same process. It's a difference in the quality of intelligence, but it's interesting because it goes into it. And more recently, my old boss at one place wrote a book called Stealth Warriors with Tom Clancy. It's a good book. It just came out recently, and it goes into the history of special ops. But these are all factual relationships of what's going on in the world, and I think people would enjoy it because it's not biased, and it's very good factual information in all those books.
Well, Brian, this has been really fascinating, and I appreciate your insights very much. I look forward to talking to you again. This is Minda Wilson with Urgent Care.